another brilliant session with me, Max Fellows, who is your host, with my two incredible guests today, Clare Melton, Head of Global Events at IHS Markit, and Max Gethin, who is the client partner at Matter Experience Agency. And today we're going to be talking about the huge broad topic of what the future looks like for the events industry post-COVID as we return or come out of the state of flux that we've been in, what that looks like, possible trends and formats to be aware of. Now, for those that are watching this on demand, or should we say catch up, you can drop in any of your comments to us via our email, which is hello@thevirtualeventdirectory, or equally just get in touch with us via socials. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and equally if there's things that you want to hear about going forward in terms of topics, then do let us know. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into this. It's a lovely conversation we're having today, and it's going to be about 30 to 40 minutes. So as we're talking about the future of events, we're going to start off with a big perhaps question and then go into the details. So I'm going to steer this towards you, Max, first. I'm going to really ask, in terms of your agency and the brands that you work with and the events that you've been delivering, what's been the biggest impact in terms of how you've evolved and changed as a result of COVID over the last, say, 12 months?
Well, I'd say from the beginning of the pandemic, our initial response was to essentially start investing and developing a specialist team within the agency to tackle the kind of virtual and hybrid part of events. So that was investing in talent, investing in upskilling the team, and we ultimately created a subdivision of the agency, Matter Virtual Experiences, which ultimately was kind of created to ensure our clients are at the front of innovation, understanding audience engagement trends, and really consulting on how we approach events and really interact with all audiences in the most kind of effective way. And now we've been doing that for the last kind of 18 months or so, and we've been looking at the virtual side of things and building communities through big platforms like Hopin, or more kind of immersive virtual experiences where we created a virtual showroom for Canon. But then recently, as we've kind of come out of lockdown, that team is really consulting on one, the re-engaging live and in-person audiences, but two, creating those contingency plans. So if we do get into another lockdown, or some local lockdown happens and we can't run the event as we want, there is either a smaller hybrid option or a virtual option as well.
And do you think that there's been a common thread, I suppose, through that, in terms of certain narratives or rules of thumb that you have tried to kind of include or thread through those different event formats?
I'd say one of the big things, and it's no secret, is content is king, and it has been for a long time, but that's just been heightened over the last kind of 12 months, specifically from the events side of things. We're making sure that every event has the highest production values possible. Everyone's now used to broadcast quality content, and we're glued to our screens watching Netflix every day, and we expect that quality to continue right the way through to every live experience we're experiencing on a virtual platform.
Yeah, brilliant. I agree with that, especially around the kind of content and quality of it. And Claire, from your perspective, and I suppose the brilliant thing of having you both on today is that they kind of different perspective, different viewpoints and things. From your perspective, from a brand and knowing obviously other brands and things like that in your networking community, there's obviously been that massive shift to virtual, but how's that really evolved over the last kind of 6 to 12 months? And in the same kind of question really, in terms of, has there been a consistent thread or rule of thumb that we have to do it a certain way, or there has to be this aspect to it?
So I would say that we've probably seen a bigger shift in how events are delivered from a corporate perspective in the last 18 months than we probably have done in the last 20 years. I think for all of us, though, I would position this by saying I'm at IHS Markit now. I wasn't when the pandemic started, and I was at another corporate. But from my own experience, and also talking to other event leads within corporates, right, I think everybody had that period of utter shock, like complete shock from every angle. There was the culture shock. There was the fact that I don't think any of us felt properly tooled up to be able to run these events virtually, right? None of us were event producers. We were all exceedingly good logistics people, operations people, and always had those guys in black, sat at the back of the room doing our production for us. And suddenly we were in a position where, with support, we were having to do everything ourselves. And as soon as everything went online, there was a period of transition, a very clear period of transition with our stakeholders. And then suddenly all of our stakeholders wanted everything at the same time, all at once. Everything that was going to be a 3-day conference, for example, somewhere suddenly became sessions left, right and centre. And so I'd say the biggest shift for us really was walking our stakeholders through the process that meant that they could understand what the content should be that should go online, that you couldn't just take an event that should have been 3 days in Berlin or a week in Barcelona and stick it online and expect everyone to sit and watch it. I think that was a massive learning for us. And to Max's point as well, again, learned very quickly and possibly the hard way in some cases that content really was king. So to the point around not being able to run a 5-hour conference online and expect people to watch it, the way content had to be delivered, the messaging, and also the content that was current and fresh and up to date, and the way that was delivered became extremely important. We were working in such a fast-paced environment that you had to make sure that what you were putting on and the content you were delivering was topical and current, because it was so much easier for our audiences just to hit the leave button and just not to be present, or to register and possibly register for 3 or 4 different things all at the same time, and then make a choice on the day as to what virtual event to attend based on what was going on in their world at that time. So certainly once we made that transition and we kind of got over our culture shock a bit, took our stakeholders on that journey to help them translate what should have been live or in person rather onto the screen, and really working through that process of the content that was going to translate well and potentially what should be held off.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point. I'm going to come back to this around the kind of the relevant format, because I think that's a really good point that we should go in further on. I just wanted to pick up the point that you mentioned around the stakeholder piece, and obviously there's an education piece that we all have gone through in terms of upskilling, and to your point about people in black at the back of the room, and actually we're now all in a way those kind of producers, whether we wanted to or not. But when you talk about stakeholders and the fact that almost that I suppose education for them, is it that in doing so you're able to maintain things like budget, or has there been a need to be able to say, look, actually it's not a case of, to your point about a 5-day conference in Berlin and just sticking it as a 1-day online. It doesn't work like that, but equally there's still the budget needs to produce something of a quality. Did that education piece really help with that, or actually across the board was it a case of budgets kind of were cut as a precautionary overhead piece?
I think it was very much on a case-by-case basis. I don't think anyone went into anything, especially for the first year that we were doing this, first 9 months to a year, thinking principally about the cost of what we were trying to do online. It was still talking to our customers, we're talking to potential clients and getting messages out there. There was a big piece around budget, around investment in platforms. I know across the industry there was a lot of conversation around investing in bespoke platforms versus off the shelf versus what does the right job. But I think that the whole point around being able to convey messaging to clients and to potential clients, and to do that well in a format that would continue to engage, especially once I think we probably saw towards last September, October, when people started to hit that fatigue, that Zoom fatigue that we all heard about. The delivery of the content and making sure we were still speaking to clients in a relevant way and a fresh way was probably more important than looking at the budget and thinking, we can just keep this on Zoom because it's way cheaper than doing it in any other way, for example. So there were obviously conversations. I'm sure there were conversations going on in boardrooms up and down the land and across the world around the fact that doing this kind of presentation is going to be cheaper because you're not in a room and you're not having to hire in those teams. But we were also having conversations about the fact that, look, if you want to do something that looks great, that's over a number of days, or that utilizes breakouts, or that provides a better end user experience than potentially just dialing into a Zooms or a team events meeting, then budgets are pretty like for like. So don't be expecting that this is going to save you money in the long term.
Yeah, completely agree. And that conversation, to your point, has probably been had time and time again in every business for sure. So, we then, without dwelling too much then on the COVID piece, it's actually now taking some of these learnings and some of these interesting developments really into moving forward and really kind of with that mindset now and looking forward. One of the things I wanted to ask you both, and Max, will come to you first, is really, do we think then as a result of this, and you mentioned some really interesting elements around the format of, and Claire mentioned about the current thing, the current formats and being on trend with, do we think inherently the role of events has changed and what it does? Because when we talk about things like on-demand webinars and podcasts, obviously everyone's got a podcast now and things, so there is this ready to grab, digest information. You know, does an event now, or will it continue to be that informative type session, or does it mean something else?
I think you can break it down into kind of two sectors, really. First, looking at the kind of corporate side, which obviously where Claire specialises in, and you know, there are elements of it that work. So being able to sign in with a global audience and get big reach from international offices and all of that is fantastic. But that networking piece just didn't work, and I'm not going to say it failed, because they obviously had a role to play, but every client we speak to and their stakeholders and people within them, they want that face-to-face networking, building those relationships, and it doesn't quite land across Zoom. I mean, content can be delivered very well virtually, and you know, as we were saying, you know, taking the 2-hour keynote on a Zoom or on a virtual meeting doesn't work. But if you drop that down to 20 minutes with a really engaging speaker and some audience interaction, then you can get that message across and your audience is engaged. From the consumer side of things, I think we have seen some success with virtual events there, but from clients we're working with, brands want to get back out there. They want to authentically engage with their audiences, and that ultimately is one of the best ways, through experiential, immersive, and in-person events.
And Claire, I suppose, would you agree with that then, in terms of the role or purpose of an event has changed, and whether there's now kind of different formats? There's the kind of the broadcast type event, and then there's the more engaging or interactive type event. What's your thinking?
100%. And you saw me nodding along probably when Max was talking about networking. I think from a corporate perspective, the biggest fail of this, moving everything online in the pandemic, has just been the inability to be able to translate networking online, right? And I will honestly, hand on heart, say, having explored a number of different options and solutions and formats and timings and platforms, nothing replicates networking like being in a room, shaking someone's hand, having a conversation face to face, not having to wait for those cues on screen. Someone stop talking, can I introduce myself? So for us, I think, and generally I think for corporates, my view is that you'll see events falling into two boxes, right? I think you'll have the content, quick and dirty, very thought leadership led sessions, which would probably traditionally have been before work, breakfast, drop in, have a croissant, sit, listen to a presentation for half an hour and go, or lunch sessions. And I think those we will see staying online, because you're not having to ask people to travel in, take time out of their day to be in a room for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then get back to an office somewhere. And then I think you'll have the networking piece, which will, because we know it can't be replicated on screen, will continue to grow as an in-person format. So you'll continue to see, or start to see again, networking events, potentially with a thought leadership element as well, but where corporates want to get their clients in a room, they want to be able to have that face-to-face with them, then nothing can replicate being in person. But what I would also say is we're definitely seeing a shift in taking learnings from the way sessions have been delivered online and trying to translate those into in person. So for conferences, for example, thinking about how people have engaged with their session lengths, for example. I think we've all got very used to our attendees' concentration spans being reduced from sitting in a room for 2 hours down to potentially 40 minutes on a session, right, before they have to go and put the kettle on or get ready for the next meeting or whatever that might be. So we're now starting to think around what's worked well, how have people's behaviours changed, not necessarily in the way they consume content on screen versus in person, but that their attention spans, the duration that they want to spend consuming something, and how can we translate that into the in-person experience to kind of get the best of both worlds? Yeah.
I mean, that perfectly kind of segues on to the next question that I had, really, was with some of that, and Max mentioned the content session length at kind of the 20 minutes, and then obviously you've echoed exactly that. What are the positives, well, and negatives, but mainly focusing on the positives kind of moving forward that you think are going to shape what's the next 12 months of events going to look like? What are those key things that have happened that we've adapted to that actually think that is for the better regardless? And do we see those moving forward with us, and how? And I suppose that's the both of you, perhaps Claire, because you
yeah. So certainly I think talking about session length again and the way we deliver sessions, I think we're far more open now to experimenting with what sessions might look like, how they're consumed, the tech that might be used in sessions, interactivity, definitely the kind of session length, bite-sized chunk sessions of getting people in, maybe delivering 3 or 4 sessions in a far faster paced environment than expecting people literally to take their coffee into a room and sit and look at a screen for 2 hours before the next coffee break. So I think all those things, and certainly the technology as well, definitely at the moment thinking about delivering events where they're probably for the next year, we're going to have to be thinking about there being a virtual audience as well somewhere, because of the way people are, or countries are approaching travel at different speeds, and restrictions are lifting at different paces. And technology is going to play a lot into that. And I think the way that has evolved over the last 12 to 18 months and what that is enabling us to do in terms of bringing a fresh approach to our in-person sessions will definitely be taken as a positive moving forward.
And I'm going to come back to that hybrid piece as well, because that's something that is, I think it almost needs its own kind of debate of sorts as to how effective and how relevant it's going to be moving forward. Max, from your perspective, in terms of positives that have happened, or whether it is practices or formats and things moving forward from I suppose both from a kind of a brand, from the agency perspective that you have across a number of different brands, but equally from perhaps more of a consumer side as well.
Well, I'd say, just sticking on the corporate, that access to data from virtual events is something we've been able to understand exactly what content people are engaging with, where they're dropping off, and that's kind of stuff we haven't been able to have in person up to now. So taking all of that data and applying it to that return to in-person, or at least the return to in-person and the kind of virtual events we're also running. I think from a tech perspective, it's no secret that we have seen a huge amount of innovation over the last 20 months. And, we're now, that's a massive positive from the pandemic, that we've seen, perhaps 20 years worth of innovation within virtual events. And of course, now as we approach that hybrid piece, we've got so many more tools to play with, and so many more, I guess, more tech partners from an agency's perspective as well. Another piece is that sustainability one, where it's harder to justify flying 500 execs from the US over to London for a conference when they can all dial in and receive the same content online. So I think that's playing into a lot of kind of client conversations now. Obviously we all love getting people together and having a great in-person event, but it is in the back of our heads now. But I'd say one of the positives and one of the exciting things from an agency perspective is that we've become much more of a consultative partner when tackling campaigns and working with brands. So being involved in those kind of earlier conversations around how the event is almost playing into the kind of full marketing mix and campaign, and how we're measuring and tracking it, and then how it's kind of, I guess, becoming much less in silo than it was back before the pandemic, really.
Yeah. And I would also agree with that. I think from a corporate perspective, we're certainly viewing our tech partners now as partners on projects. And I know for me, especially talking about conferences that we're looking to deliver over the next 3 to 6 months, quite often some of the first conversations I'm having with new tech partners are, talk to me about how you might have done this before, right? Because I'm new to this, you've probably seen it with other clients, whatever this might be. Like, how would you, tech partner, looking at our session, our content, what we're trying to achieve, what have you seen that might make this work better than the way we're approaching it with the limited knowledge that we've got? So I would definitely agree with Max on that we're working with tech partners way more consultatively now than I think we've ever done in the past.
And I suppose that goes across the board in terms of any partnership of sorts, is that there now is a much more, I mean, we've all been through this together. So going forward, another positive of that is that more consultative and partnership-led approach to the way in which we're looking at things. And Max, you make a really good point there around the kind of the campaign approach. Now, it's no lie that the agencies have always wanted to have a seat at the table to be able to help advise and influence stakeholders earlier on. That hasn't perhaps happened, but now it's seemingly there's a need to, and equally, from a budgetary perspective, where there perhaps is a budget pot and that could be now split, and where it seems like an agency perhaps is doing themselves out of business to an extent, but equally it's the right mix of a spend around actually the pre-coms and taking content from an event and perhaps more of a consumer. And, you know, I think we've spoken about it in the past about that kind of experience piece, but actually it being, right, okay, some of that budget needs to go to the application of that, because we know that we can get a bigger reach. Footfall is not what it used to be, so let's go really hard on using this as that moment in time to create that content, and then look at creating this campaign approach to it. So I completely agree, and I actually think that's going to be really, really kind of tangible and more frequent in across all aspects of, so corporate, consumer, is that kind of more holistic consultative approach. So yeah, I agree with you entirely. So then just dialing back to the hybrid piece, and that obviously is a format and not so much a trend, but equally it's something that's with us now. And Claire, you mentioned that need to be able to consider those at home, and inclusivity is really, really important, and not necessarily going to trend, but something that we have to be really aware of, whether it's disabilities and access, or equally from a tech and you know, from other perspectives. Do we see hybrid being something that's going to be around forever? Is that something that we see being a very expensive kind of moment in time? Or to your point, and you mentioned the two types, and I'm going to say a third, so you've got your quick and dirty content, you've got your more networking in person, and then you have your much more kind of brand experience, your immersive piece.
Yeah. Does
it kind of, will it fizzle out and you will actually just pick one or the other?
Do you know, I think this is a really interesting question, because a year ago, I'd have said that hybrid is here to stay, right? I think we'd got to a stage where we were creeping back in person and then creeping back online again, as we've had to do this year. And I would have said hybrid, absolutely the way forward. I think in the future, all we'll see is split audiences, and we're going to have to get our heads around this. As we are coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, and we're having conversations around how we can deliver events safely in person, conversations I'm having around hybrid are taking on a different tone. And that is that they're not necessarily around providing people with the same experience at the same time, but around how we amplify content to a wider audience, but not necessarily assuming it's in the same time frame. So what content can we take and edit down and make, you know, like a Reader's Digest style piece out of it for broadcast later? What can we use in campaigns? To your point about campaignifying, if that's the word, what we're doing.
Now, hey Claire, you can trademark that one.
Quick, make a note. And taking bits of content and maybe drip feeding the market with them, for example. How the formats we're using, are they broadcast through LinkedIn? Are they YouTube snippets? Are they, you know, full relays on a platform in real time? So I think a year ago, if you'd asked any stakeholder about hybrid, they would have assumed that you've got a camera at the back of the room and everybody at home is getting exactly the same experience as everybody in the room. Now we're talking about using that content that's being generated in the room to give a much bigger audience an experience that is parallel to the experience of those that are in the room, but not necessarily running concurrently with that experience, and potentially getting to the same point via very different routes. So long way of saying, I think it's here to stay, but not how we thought it was maybe 6 to 9 months ago.
And does that even then warrant the kind of term hybrid actually then? Is it?
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And
I agree with the budgetary aspect of that as well, is to really effectively try and capture, record, stream and live edit is very expensive, and you're talking kind of additional third on top of a normal budget in order to try and do that and some.
Absolutely. And also I think it's forcing stakeholders and event producers to think about what content is coming out of conferences, because content that's delivered that's very now in the moment has no shelf life. And therefore, if you're capturing that and broadcasting it later or saving it for later, to make it available later to audiences, it might be out of date. And I think people are having to think very carefully about the content. There will be content that has to be in the moment now, topic that is extremely current, that is relevant to those in the room. But anything that needs to be broadcast over a period of time or later, people are having to think very carefully now about the messaging and how they're sort of portraying the message that they want to get across, to make sure that it remains evergreen and it's still consumable however many weeks or months down the line. Otherwise, it's a waste of money, right?
Really good point, to be honest, about that dating of content. And actually, if you have this archaic library, then really it can be quite off-putting. Just before I ask Max about hybrid, quick one. In terms of then platform to distribute content, what do you see being the most important from a corporate perspective? Is it going to be a YouTube? Is it going to be more podcast? Is it going to be quick snippets of, I don't know, almost kind of Instagram lives? Or sort of, what do you see in terms of, for you or for the corporate market being the channel of choice to distribute that content on demand?
I think you'll see a lot of bespoke platforms or websites that are optimized, so corporate websites that are optimized with potentially a content library attached to them. You know, I know corporates I've worked for in the past as well that have used YouTube very well to have content distributed, and even pre-pandemic, actually, even talking about 5-10 years ago, using YouTube to get videos out there, to get content out there. But I think moving forward, it's my view is a lot of corporates will be looking for a one-stop shop. So you've got the event website and you've got a library section on that event website where you can consume your content, and that will be kept refreshed and updated as you go.
To your point, that kind of evergreen piece of then merging it. And another point to that, then, if we're talking of a campaign type approach, equally, then you are being able to demonstrate better value for your sponsors by having more footfall, albeit digitally, to a site in order to
place.
There's a community. So that kind of almost that ecosystem of sorts in terms of community content and things. I think that's a really good point, and that kind of emergence of organic, or should I say original owned hosting platforms. That's a really good point there. And one hadn't necessarily actually thought of that much, so that's really good. And Max, from your perspective, kind of the hybrid, and again from an agency, and I know that you guys do at Matter, you do kind of everything from kind of your exhibitions, your corporate conferencing, through to more of your kind of experience as well. The hybrid piece for you, is that here to stay? What format do you think or see that taking from a trend, should we say? So
I would say a hybrid isn't actually something that's new. It's something we've been doing for years, really, but over the last 12 months we've stuck a name on it and caused a big buzz around the industry. The way we've kind of looked at it is we've kind of split it into two kind of different, I guess, routes for hybrid. So first being that kind of passive one, which is, as Claire said, putting a webcam or something at the back of the stage and recording that content and broadcasting it out, where the audience are getting that content and it's live, but they're not necessarily engaging with other attendees or the speakers on stage or even the virtual audience. Whereas that active side is where the virtual audience is very much participating in the event itself. But it's certainly not two for one in any way, shape or form. You're creating two events when you're making a hybrid event. So there's the live audience have completely different agendas and ways of consuming content, and what they're looking for from that event to the virtual side. So it's really creating two separate customer journeys, creating bespoke content and linking them across, I guess, linking them across a platform of some description. I think going back to almost the last question on the content side of things, one of the things we're looking at and work on with clients is creating events that are, experienced by a few, because as we know, an in-person event can only have a certain number of people attend, but the reach it can have from a content perspective, and chopping it up, broadcasting it, getting it up on your socials and engaging various other audiences. You can have a 100-person small experiential event, but you can very, very cleverly work that content to reach millions across all your channels and websites, etc. So I think in answer to your question, hybrid is definitely here to stay. I think, as Claire said, it's perhaps not what we were talking about 12 months ago, but there's an element of it that certainly works, but it's being very considered with how we approach it, how making sure we're addressing both audiences' needs, and then being realistic about budget. It's not going to be just chuck on a broadcast and it's going to be the same price. I mean, we did quite an interesting event with Virgin Media at the BAFTAs where we leveraged holograms, which we've typically seen them in Beyonce's performances and big music productions, and actually use them as an interactive piece where people on the red carpet could speak to audiences at home, because we couldn't have any fans at the event itself. And that was a really, really nice way of using kind of existing technology in a new way, which engaged people both at home and at the event itself.
I'd say what I'm trying to do as well is work with stakeholders to almost map their programme and have a column on a spreadsheet, for example, for in-person and a column for virtual attendees, and just think stage by stage and step by step through that programme of what each audience is going to be consuming. I went to an event that did this fantastically well back in the summer, where whenever there was content on stage, the virtual audience would see something very different. And then whenever there wasn't content on stage for the in-person event, the in-person audience was potentially off having a coffee or networking, then the speakers that had been on stage were then in a studio talking about what they had been talking about on stage, but maybe talking about some of the questions they'd had, and it was a really good interview format. And clearly there'd been a lot of thought around what each audience was consuming and at what time. And I think that's the way, as we move forward through hybrid, that's the way the entire event experience is going to have to be considered. When the in-person audience is off for a break, don't just assume that your virtual audience is also going to be putting the kettle on. You need to be making sure that both audiences are engaged, but that might be at very different times.
So that really then comes down to that kind of experience journey mapping and doing it in real detail. And that level of is something that we have seen in certain aspects in the past, but now kind of thrust forward and needs that finite detail too. So I think it's a really good point raised for sure. So with that then, when we're talking about, Max, you mentioned about the hologram technology, it's existing tech, but obviously used in a quite clever and interesting way. What else do we see from I suppose, best practices or kind of emerging trends or innovation that will shape? We're all in agreement, I think, then that hybrid is absolutely here and it will stay in some shape or form, but not as we knew it. And equally that kind of crew in person at home, seeing it, networking digital in person is not going to work, and nor is the price tag associated with it. So what else do we think that's going to kind of move it forward? And what else do we see, coming up from I suppose, trends or innovation perspective? Max, with you, and anything from tech to, I suppose, new formats. You mentioned sustainability. What are you seeing or preempting as coming?
Well, I'd say one of the interesting pieces, and we did a recent study on kind of changes in behaviours in audiences over the last kind of 18, 12 months, 20 months. And we've seen that, people have been confined, they've been locked into their houses, they haven't experienced new things. So very much from a consumer perspective, it's almost taking it back to, that almost experiential revolution we had kind of with millennials 10, 15 years ago, where everybody wants to get back out. They want to go and smell, touch, taste new things. And it's very much, engaging with a brand in a way that's, you can't replicate digitally. So we're seeing very much that kind of creative, immersive and experiential piece from a consumer side. And it's really exciting from an agency perspective, because we're working on some amazing brands with some really creative applications. And, it's after, with virtual has its fun, but it's, there's not quite the same as going to a major event where you get to touch, taste and experience new things. So that's a very big kind of key thing we're looking at from consumer side. I think from kind of more of the tech side and the virtual side, that production quality, we've seen some amazing virtual studios and XR studios, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that, or that production quality is going to continue. I mean, we're used to it now, and I think going and producing a virtual event where it feels kind of like an afterthought or a second thought, people aren't going to want to go and do that, especially if they're paying for a corporate ticket where they would spend £500, £1,000 on attending an event. if the virtual event isn't up to scratch, then I think we're going to struggle to recruit people onto the program.
So that broadcast type quality piece there that you mentioned, that kind of studio. Yeah. Everyone needs to now go build themselves a studio or find a very good partner with a very kind of decent studio. And is there anything else that you mentioned? Obviously, the explosion of experiential in terms of we're going to see continued increase of quality around production levels, and that I think both in person and virtually. Is there anything else that you would deem as well that people should be, those audiences listening, that should be aware of or go check out? Or
I'd say that inclusivity piece is massive still, because one of the insights we've got from our recent report is that there is a significant portion of the population who are not ready to attend events yet. So giving them the opportunity to engage with the content, whether it's through a broadcast, a hybrid event, or some other format, I think there's a massive kind of need to make sure that everyone is included, everyone feels included, and they are still getting that same experience. Because let's face it, the COVID isn't gone, and if anything is slightly on the rise over here in the UK. So there's a need to make people feel safe and give them the opportunity to engage with peers, colleagues, and the brand.
So it's providing that level of choice then, and making sure that it's inclusive. Yeah, some really good ones there. And Claire, from your perspective, what do you see kind of continuing on the rise, or things that we should, as a trend or new practice, be aware of and think about?
I'd have to say, agreeing with Max, that production values are going to be key, right? Because we've all now been doing this for 18 months from a corporate perspective. I think it's no longer, it's going to be less and less acceptable to get away with doing some significant events on a Zoom platform or on a Teams events type platform, webinars, an investment in those production values, whether it be virtual studios. Seen some great tech around virtual studios that bring video feeds of speakers in from all over the world and can have them looking as if they're all sat at the same table, as if they're on something like a question time format. So things like that really make the clients and our corporate consumers feel as if there has been investment, because this is not going to be acceptable for people very much longer. And let's face it, corporate clients and corporate consumers, or consumers of corporate events, have a way of talking with their feet, and that is that leave button, right? As I said before, people's tolerances have become far reduced, people's attention spans have been far reduced, and there is significant pressure on people's diaries now, and there is a lot out there in terms of virtual events. I think this is the noisiest marketplace I've ever been in terms of events, corporate events, and what's going on and when. People have a choice, and at the end of the day, what the event looks like and how it's put on, and the values and the potentially the technology that's implemented, and what that experience, the whole experience looks like, is going to persuade people to either stay or go.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think on the virtual side of things, that next kind of evolution is this kind of birth of the metaverse now, and how that's going to kind of impact brands kind of, I guess, re-engaging in that virtual world. I mean, we are seeing it's still very much in its kind of early days, but we're seeing big players like Facebook have announced, they're investing in 10,000 new people in Europe to create the metaverse. And I think that's going to be a very interesting battlefield for brands, essentially, to get people into their events. I mean, we've seen obviously the Ariana Grande Fortnite events, Travis Scott in Fortnite, and that's going to continue. We're going to see so much innovation within that kind of space over the next 10 years. And the brands who activate in there first, the brands who are pioneering and making sure that they're engaging audiences in the most authentic way out in the metaverse will win that battle. And I think, it's a very exciting time for that space. And, I think we're just at the start of it, and we're going to see some amazing work.
It's interesting that you mentioned the metaverse piece, because obviously we've seen the dizzying kind of highs of esports and the gaming aspect of, and people kind of choosing to play virtually, and obviously Oculus with Facebook and things like that, and getting into these other worlds. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it develops. You can see it really easily and clearly from a consumer perspective, but equally from a corporate events perspective. Actually now things like interactive meetings, where Facebook was saying about having these avatars but you wearing an Oculus and things like that. it would almost accelerate further this. Well, is there a risk of us being so isolated then, living our lives through a virtual world, that we become completely isolated?
I feel like that's somewhat the vision, isn't it? It's replacing work, rest and play, and providing a platform for you to kind of interchange and go between anywhere, really. You're going to have virtual offices where you've got your VR headset and you can speak to Max in the office next door, or you can go see a gig, you can go shopping. The use of NFTs and crypto within it, you're going to be able to ultimately go from a Burberry store right the way through to a Google conference in the click of a button. And it's going to be an exciting playground for brands to work in.
I agree. But what I think from a corporate perspective is that, and the feedback we've had certainly over the last 6 months in particular, is that people are desperate just to get back in face to face again. So whilst I think there's definitely a place for that technology, and we will see huge amounts of it coming in the next, 5 to 10 years, people still want to get together. And the number of questions that we've had around that conference used to do, when's it coming back in person? It's just not replacing that the client interaction.
Do you think that's going to be how do I put this? Do you think there's going to be a resurgence of, there's because of the lack of engagement and interactivity, that once people have kind of re-engaged and attended a number of events and things, that actually that's going to be kind of like a peak, and then it will kind of settle down actually into a more of a kind of I suppose an equilibrium of both of actually, yes, we've had our fix, we feel like we're kind of back in the world again, we've met some people actually, but that conference, I could just do it virtually.
Potentially, absolutely. And I think going back to the point earlier on around the type of content that's out there and the message that we're trying to convey, I think you're right. I think over the next 6 to 9 months potentially, or depending on how the winter goes over the next year, we will probably see a lot of people wanting to get back out there and go to in-person events, right? Because we all know, those of us that have been to in-person events, nothing quite replaces them. But I think people have also got to a stage where they know they can be selective, because the pressures on time have changed, the way we live our lives have changed, the crashing together of working from home and therefore domestic and professional, crashing together over the last 18 months have meant that I think we've probably changed as people in terms of the amount of time we're willing to spend out there and at those events. And I genuinely think that people will start to look at the demands on their time and think, I need to do that in person. That's quality time that I'm spending with peers or prospects or whoever that might be. But actually, there's a world over here that I can do at home using some of these amazing technologies that are coming up, and I don't lose anything by doing that. So certainly I think we'll probably see a shift once we've all got out there and satisfied our appetite for talking to people in person again, where we will start to look at quality over quantity in terms of attending events.
I totally agree with that. I think, we're going to have to communicate that perceived value of an event for, people aren't always going to just travel up to Manchester or wherever, if there's going to take, a day out and a night in a hotel from your day-to-day seeing family or work itself. So people are, as you said, everyone's going to have that kind of romance period of going back out and enjoying it. But there will be an element of, right, I can't go to a conference every month. I'm going to have to strip it down to 3 a year. And those ones I'll invest time and money in.
So the power really is then back into the hands of the audiences then in terms of selections and actual emphasis on brands to have to up their game in terms of the communicating of the value. Perceived value is definitely a big one. We've absolutely smashed through time and we're pretty much at the end already, which is absolutely rapid, and I really, really enjoyed the conversation. I wanted to ask, I've got 2 last questions which we'll touch on fairly quickly. The one being, and I'll ask you both, is in terms of the way that we measure events, given with this innovation, we talk about tech and some of the new formats, content, do you think the way in which we look at KPIs and measurement will evolve, and what do we think those metrics will look like in the next 6-12 months? And Max, just staying with you.
So I'd say one of the things which events has always struggled with is proving that ROI, and how do we actually measure the effectiveness. I think from a corporate side, there will be a lot more, tracking, measurement and integration of CRM and making sure that the conversations and the attendance is tracked and put into your CRM, so sales teams, marketing teams know exactly who's engaged with what content, who they've spoken to. And I think that's, it's something we haven't actually touched on, but proving the value of events. We know they work, but we've seen over the last 20 months events haven't been happening, but businesses still have functioned. It's getting back out there, and how can we just £1 million, £2 million budget for this conference if we don't know it's actually being effective? So I think, corporate side is going to have to start proving their value a lot more, and event budgets will be scrutinised.
And how, well, I suppose, Claire, it's probably a question directly to you then. When I mentioned metrics, what do they look like, and how are we demonstrating that and look to report that really going forward?
I completely agree with Max. I think, if you'd asked me 2 years ago what a successful event looked like, I probably would have said that the key metric for most operations people would have been bums on seats. And that's just not the case anymore, right? Because we know people can't necessarily travel. We know that virtual audiences, you tend to get much higher registrations than you'd ever see in person, but people dip in and out of content. So you might have 3 times the number of people register for a virtual event, but only spend a quarter of the time at that event than they would do if it was in a hotel somewhere and they had to actually get there. So I think from a metrics perspective, 100% tracking the attendance at an event right the way through the CRM process, understanding leads generated, sales generated as a result of attendance. Virtual allows us to track what people are looking at, especially where we've got on-demand libraries. I can definitely see a kind of Netflix model of, we noticed that you watch this, and therefore how about we recommend this content to you from a corporate perspective, and being able to have algorithms that provide clients or corporate consumers with tailored content, and then being able to track what they're watching, how long they're watching that for, and whether that results in them picking up the metaphorical phone to the sales team. So I definitely think integrations through tech stack throughout CRM processes such as Salesforce will become more and more expensive and more and more important in terms of being able to justify event budgets. And as I say, going along and saying we want to do this event. Last year we had 400 people, and this year we're hoping for 500 people. Just isn't going to be a thing anymore. Yeah,
it's a really, really good point, and first made by Max and absolutely then articulated by yourself in terms of that integration of that tech stack piece and actually working so much more collaboratively with sales, because once before you get people at the event, the sales team, like a hungry pack of wolves, go out and kind of claim their accounts and go and try and sell them, really. But actually now, in terms of that, understanding the CRM aspect of and then leveraging that big data and how we refine it and utilize it to personalize that experience is going to be really interesting. I think it's absolutely fascinating. It's a really, really good point. It's really good nuggets of information there, both from an advice perspective, but also in terms of practical elements to make sure that you are doing, regardless whether it's corporate, consumer, or anything in between, really. I'm going to do my best to very, very quickly try and highlight and recap on what we've discussed, because there's a plethora of great content. So first of all, we talked about it, the fact that agility is probably the most important thing, because as we twist and turn through potential lockdowns and things, we have to move at pace. So having a working model and a team that can work at pace wherever they are is going to be important. Content is still king, absolutely hands down. But the way in which we use content, the way in which we message, is going to change and evolve, and particularly the formats of, and Claire mentioned about things like YouTube, and we talked about podcasts and things, but actually it's going to keep evolving still to make sure that people are digesting it in the way that they want, and having that personalization as to you get it the way you want is going to be key, and that may be the difference to people choosing to watch your content over someone else's. We're going to evolve continually, and we need to communicate both internally to stakeholders as we do that, to make sure that they're along with us for the journey if there's a new way of doing things, but equally externally to make sure that whilst our consumers or attendees now are very much in power or empowered, we need to communicate with them effectively to show the value of why they should be attending it. Claire mentioned about events now taking almost a new format. Whilst hybrid is here to stay, not as we know it though, it's completely evolved in what it is. There are now 3 types of of events almost. There is the dirty, I like the quicker dirty content format. There is the networking, the in-person connection, and then there's the more immersive brand experience, perhaps more the consumer side. And then as we move on, it's looking at kind of the platforms and things. So we talked about YouTube, but actually there's a really interesting point that as a future trend, we're seeing a lot of brands, and Claire mentioned brands, creating their own platforms where they can own their content, and equally the journey around that, whether it's taking a Netflix format or otherwise. But, you know, being able to host, and we talked about this ecosystem of user of sorts or attendee, is being able to keep them in the branded environment and being able to nurture them and you know, feed them and supply them with the right information that they want. It'll only help build that brand affinity, but equally from a sponsor value and things like that, there's loads more value to be had there. The customer journey map is going to be essential, and really thinking about that in detail. And then really lastly, of what's coming, the explosion of experiential, the rebirth of experientials here, more studios, so high production levels, inclusivity and giving people choice is going to be paramount, and exciting new formats. And then lastly, around measurement, the tracking and integration piece. But the huge thing here is the big data aspect and the integration with the sales team. And actually it's not bums on seats and attendance, it's going to be so much more than that. So much more rich detail needed, and what that looks like from a sales cycle. Did I capture it there? Did I?
You did very well.
Really good.
Excellent, perfect. Well, look, from myself, Max Fellows, and from the team at the Virtual Event Directory and part of our Knowledge series, Claire and Max, I just want to say a huge thank you for taking part. It's been a pleasure, and my mind is absolutely boggling now with kind of ideas and things to try and capture and write down and stuff. We're going to be sharing this on the platform, so do make sure that you get in touch, leave your feedback. We'd love to hear it, and do check out the other videos as well. So Claire and Max, thank you very much from all of us. Really appreciated, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.